Howard W. French, author, Twitter handle HO French. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today here at the Norfolk at the same time as the US-Africa Summit. Howard is the author of China's Second Continent, which I read one weekend after receiving it very kindly. Howard, I'd first like to touch on the book because it's this wonderful part travelogue through hard-to-visit African places. What gave you the idea to put this together? When did the genesis of the idea come together?
Thank you, first of all, Ali Khan. It's great to be with you. I'm a fan of yours on Twitter too.
Well, I'm a fan of yours too.
Yeah, we've picked up stuff from each other. It's been very pleasurable.
Thank you.
I worked for the New York Times for many years. I was a correspondent in West and Central Africa in the 90s. And then I went to Asia. I worked in Japan for 5 years and then China for 6 years. And while I was in China, I lived in Shanghai as a bureau chief there, and in an office complex that had been one of the first Western property developments in Shanghai after the opening of the country. And as such, it was the sort of favored venue of visiting foreign head of state delegations. And my office looked out upon the entrance to this office complex. It was a hotel office complex. And I began to notice in the sort of middle of the last decade, the arrival of more and more African delegations.
So we're talking 204, 205.
That's right. Mm-hmm. More and more African delegations, head of state delegations to China. And having spent most of my life up until that point involved with Africa, I thought, you know, sure, there's something interesting going on here. Let me find out what it is. And this led to me doing a series for the New York Times about this burgeoning new relationship between post-reform China and Africa. And so I went off and I did a 3-country series for the New York Times. In 2008, I left the Times and I joined Columbia University's Faculty of Journalism. And I did a piece then, shortly afterwards, for Atlantic Magazine, in which I traveled. I took the Tazara Railroad all the way across Tanzania to the terminus in Zambia and then overland by road into the Congo.
What year was that?
So that was in 2009. I set off to do a piece that was sort of generically about this big relationship between China and Africa, but I discovered during that trip at sort of a very sort of close ground level this phenomenon of just explosive Chinese immigration or migration to Africa. And although my Atlantic piece wasn't about that per se, this planted the bug in my mind to do a piece that looks about not just the big relationships that are being forged, but the sort of undercurrent of human relationship via migration that was taking place of Chinese people essentially coming to Africa to set up shop, to build new lives here.
I found that fascinating, and a number of things I learned actually about that immigration. First of all, you estimate it to be about 1 million immigrants. I tweeted it today and somebody came back to me and said, Ali Khan, it's way higher than that. So, do you feel 1 million is the right number?
I used 1 million in the title only because that's in the academic conferences and the various kind of talking shops about this subject, that's the commonly bandied about number, but no one really knows. In the book, I actually say my own rough guess based on my own anecdotal sense of things, traveling through more than 15 countries in the year on the ground that I reported this book, is probably 2 million is closer to the number, but we really don't know. I mean, there may be 100,000 Chinese in Nigeria alone, maybe more. There may be 100,000 or close to 100,000 in Zambia. So that's 2 out of 54 African countries. If you begin to do the math, it becomes apparent very quickly that 1 million probably is insufficient.
And what I found interesting, whilst we just dwell on that immigration saga, is that you were saying that a lot of these people all came from one particular part of China, not a particularly prosperous part of it. And I found that quite interesting because when I look back at our history 4 or 5 generations ago from India, similar sort of story, unhappy with the economy there. In those days it was Gujarat, coming out here for better opportunities. So is that correct, that the majority of these immigrants are coming from a particular area? There's something happening there that's driving them towards Africa?
So what happened is, in the middle of the 1990s, China begins to survey the world, and it says to itself, we've had a fantastic run since the end of the 70s, when Deng Xiaoping begins to reform the economy. We have set up local investment zones in China that run on a capitalist basis. And we've attracted capital from, in the first instance, from Hong Kong, and then from Taiwan, and then from foreign Chinese communities in the Western United States and in Australia and other places to jumpstart our economy on a kind of globalized capitalist level. That carried us so far. In the 90s, the Chinese had the foresight to understand that whatever their great success initially, that would only take them so far in the future. And so they said, we have to go out into the world and capture our own markets. We can't just be the recipient of inward investment. We have to be the agents of economic activity around the world. And they selected Africa as a priority zone via a very astute calculation, which said, look, at post-Cold War, the West is preoccupied in other places. There's this huge continent called Africa, 1 billion people, where the West essentially is not, behaving in any particularly vigorous or imaginative way. This is the place where we can strike. We can capture these markets. We can beat the sort of tepid Western competition, and our fledgling corporations that would like to become global brands, they can establish themselves in Africa. And so the Chinese government in 1996 sets forth formally a policy called Going Out. Jiang Zemin was the president there. And he tells, the way the Chinese system works is that the center, meaning Beijing, the Communist Party, creates policy and sets priorities, and then makes it rates the provinces on the basis of how well they perform according to various policies. And so Going Out becomes a policy, and the provinces are set into competitive motion against each other in terms of who gets the most business in this new priority realm called Africa. And so you see African countries becoming the scene of great economic prospecting by Chinese construction companies, with the central government providing the financing for this, and the state companies, which have a provincial identity and basis to them, start creating projects in one place after another. We've all seen them here in Africa. Railroads, stadiums, airports, ports, highway systems, sometimes housing developments, et cetera, all built with Chinese state funding, all built by provincial level but state-owned companies coming from various places in China. The migration that has taken place subsequently has largely been a feature or a factor of the companies that come from the provinces in China that have been relatively less developed.
Yes.
In other words, companies from Shanghai, which is very rich, or Tianjin, or Beijing, or Guangzhou, where they're all relatively quite rich. These are all prosperous Eastern Chinese places. They may have come to do business in Africa according to this watchword of Go Out. But the people from these provinces have pretty much good lives and great prospects back in China already. The people from Sichuan or Henan or Hunan or Hubei or Hebei, I'm sorry, some of these to an unfamiliar audience may sound like similar sounding names, but these are all the names of sort of central and central western provinces in China where the economic takeoff has not happened as vigorously as on the eastern coast. They send their construction companies here, and the workers discover, wow, first of all of the myths and stereotypes that they have heard of Africa are largely untrue. There's not wild animals roaming the streets. People are not necessarily attacking them or mobbing them or behaving in a xenophobic way. In fact, often being very friendly to them. There's all these economic opportunities that people with relatively low skill sets and relatively modest capital can involve themselves in. And so the people who came from these parts of China where opportunity had been relatively low or stifled come to an African environment.
Yes.
And everywhere they look, they see opportunity.
Yes.
And so a 2,000-member construction crew may see 10% of its workers decide, well, I'm going to stay at the end of my 2-year contract. I'm going to stay in Kenya, or I'm going to stay in Zambia or Senegal or where have you. And here's where the interesting thing takes place. As those initial arrivals, as a result of this going out policy, begin to set up shop in various African countries and have their own successes, word seeps back to China that neighbor Joe or neighbor Lin or neighbor whoever, who you thought of as being a very ordinary guy, now he's rich. He created an ice cream factory in Malawi, or a shoe factory in Zambia, or got farming land in Mozambique, or did what have you, and has now made it. And he's sending pictures back home that is creating an emulation factor, where lots of other ordinary people from his same province, his own social set, are saying, wow, if he can do it, I can do it too. I'm going to Africa too also. And so each of those, you
So
know,
it's been a summoning power from
that's
these,
right.
yeah.
It's a pull factor that has, I think, been the key. That this emulation has really driven things exponentially, and is not finished, by the way. This will continue into the future.
Now, when I read your book, what seemed to me quite interesting was a differentiation between the Chinese, this million-man Chinese immigrant community that has come, which in some ways, when you were doing these face-to-face interviews with a fellow in Mozambique, I remember very clearly, some in West Africa, they were happy to be shot of the Chinese government. They saw this sort of African continent as a blank canvas where they could, where they could live their life more fully. How do you, people look at China as very monolithic. Is it, or who are these people seem to me like renegade, characters who were, like anyone else looking to get away from the state. Am I wrong in that analysis?
So here's what's going on in the lives of this kind of character. They come from an authoritarian country that has provided in the last generation quite good returns for many of its people, for a great many of its people, right? But which is nonetheless repressive in many ways. First of all, along with authoritarian political power comes a lot of corruption. The state is always hitting, or the party is always hitting you up in one way or another, for money, for licenses, for payoffs, kickbacks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Alongside of that, there's very little outlet for expression or criticism. You cannot openly, you can talk openly to your friends, but you cannot speak in a broader kind of social way about the frustrations of life, or especially your criticism of the state. They arrive in an African environment. Now, in the West, and even among many Africans, a prevailing sense of Africa is, in many places, I don't want to speak in too broad a generalization, but in many places of how, corrupt things are. They arrive in an African environment and they have quite the opposite impression, that this is a freewheeling place, that there is nobody following them around, that yes, they may have to pay a bribe here or there, but it's not nearly as systematic or as attentive as the type of corruption that they face in China. And so they've got a monkey off of their back. They can breathe freely and exert their own kind of genius and entrepreneurship. And even talk freely about China if they wish to.
That's right, to you.
To me all the time, and to each other, and to write about it online, for that matter. That's how I found some of these people.
So that's very interesting that, we have this two-tier, we have the state operating in a certain manner, or this very flagship type things where there's huge commitments to the continent, and then this entrepreneurial class, which, like so many other entrepreneurial classes that have come to Africa, has done extremely well. Continuing with your journey, which by the way was fascinating, it started I think in Maputo, did it not?
That's right.
And then it was absolutely fabulous. I don't know West Africa as well as you did, but and my favorite piece of just from the travelogue was when you caught up with your brother, and you described spending a night in the desert, I think, in Namibia.
That's right.
And you have the stars very close to you, and I remember that it was very powerful. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thanks.